Berlin, April 20th, 1945. Somewhere above the streets, the sky glows an unnatural orange, lit by fires that have not gone out in days. 55 feet below the Reich Chancellery garden, in a corridor lined with gray concrete and exposed pipework, a group of officers and secretaries queue quietly to shake hands with a man in a stooped, trembling posture. It is his 56th birthday. Outside, Soviet artillery has begun falling on the city center for the first time, close enough that the impacts can be felt through the bunker's reinforced ceiling as a dull, rhythmic shudder. Inside, cake is served. Children from the Goebbels family, dressed for the occasion, are photographed beside a man whose armies no longer exist as coherent formations on any map. Within this contradiction, cake and shellfire, ceremony and collapse, lies the story of the final command post of the Third Reich, and of the last, increasingly disconnected orders issued from within it. What happened in those rooms over the following 10 days would determine not just the manner of one man's death, but the final, chaotic instructions that cost the lives of thousands of soldiers and civilians who were still, technically, following orders from a war that had already been lost. To understand why a below-ground bunker became the nerve center of a collapsing state, it helps to look at the military situation that had made Berlin itself a battlefield. By early 1945, the German army was fighting a war on a shrinking map. The Ardennes offensive, Adolf Hitler's last major gamble in the West, had failed by late January, consuming reserves of fuel, armor, and experienced men that could never be replaced. In the east, the Vistula-Oder offensive launched by Soviet forces in January 1945 had covered in a matter of weeks distances that previous campaigns had taken months to achieve, bringing the Red Army to the Oder River, roughly 70 kilometers from Berlin, by early February. German industrial output, despite the remarkable efforts of Armaments Minister Albert Speer to keep factories running under sustained Allied bombing, could no longer replace losses at anything close to the rate they were occurring. Fuel shortages had become so severe that Luftwaffe pilots were receiving only a fraction of the flying hours needed to remain combat effective, and entire panzer divisions existed largely on paper, their nominal strength bearing little relation to the handful of operational tanks they could actually field. The consequence of this attrition was not simply that Germany was losing. It was that the entire administrative apparatus for waging war, the network of functioning headquarters, supply depots, and communication lines that allow a modern army to act as a coordinated whole, was disintegrating faster than any single command decision could compensate for. Berlin had never been designed to function as a frontline city. Its government ministries, its telephone exchanges, its rail marshalling yards had all been built for the administration of a continental war fought elsewhere. By March 1945, refugees fleeing the fighting in the east were arriving in the capital by the tens of thousands daily, further straining food distribution and housing in a city already reduced by years of Allied bombing raids to rubble across large sections of its center. It was against this backdrop, a capital simultaneously a government seat, a refugee destination, and an emerging battlefield, that Hitler made the decision, confirmed to his inner circle in the second half of March, to remain in Berlin rather than relocate to the so-called Alpine fortress in Bavaria that some of his staff had proposed as a more defensible final redoubt. That decision, more than any single order that followed it, determined that the last command post of the Third Reich would be a hole in the ground beneath a city under direct artillery bombardment, rather than a mountain retreat with at least the theoretical possibility of prolonged resistance. By April, the situation had become, in any conventional military sense, unsalvageable. Some 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, organized under Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, were converging on Berlin from the east and south in a pincer movement of overwhelming scale. The German forces defending the city, a patchwork of depleted Wehrmacht units, Volkssturm Home Guard conscripts as young as 14 or as old as 60, and remaining SS formations, numbered perhaps 100,000 men against attackers who outnumbered them roughly 20 to 1 in troops and even more heavily in artillery and armor. Command and control had become a fiction in the most literal sense. Telephone lines were cut daily by shelling, radio communications were unreliable and frequently intercepted, and the physical movement of dispatch riders between headquarters had become a matter of chance survival, rather than routine logistics. It was into this vacuum of accurate information that the Führerbunker's peculiar authority stepped, an authority increasingly built not on the ability to command real forces in the field, but on the psychological insistence, from one man, that the war could still somehow be won. The bunker itself deserves attention on its own terms, because its physical structure shaped the decisions made within it. Construction of what became known as the Führerbunker had begun in two stages. An initial, shallower structure, the Vorbunker, was built in 1936 beneath the old Reich Chancellery garden, intended originally as an air raid shelter rather than a command post. As Allied bombing of Berlin intensified from 1943 onward, a second, deeper structure was excavated beneath it, roughly 9 meters below ground, with reinforced concrete walls and ceiling up to 4 meters thick in places, designed to withstand a direct hit from the heaviest conventional bombs then in Allied use. The complex was compact by the standards of a national command center, around 30 rooms in total across both levels, connected by a narrow central corridor barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Ventilation was mechanical, drawing air through filtered shafts that also, by necessity, brought in the diesel fumes of generators running almost continuously to power lighting, telephone exchanges, and a single radio transmitter that provided the bunker's only reliable link to the outside world. Living conditions were, by every surviving account, oppressive. Electric light replaced any sense of day or night, and staff frequently lost track of whether it was morning or evening above ground. Condensation ran down concrete walls. The map room, where military briefings were held, became infamous among staff for the increasingly one-sided shouting matches in which Hitler, working from situation maps that frequently showed divisions and corps that no longer existed in any meaningful strength, would order counterattacks by formations that had been destroyed weeks earlier or existed only as depleted remnants far from where the map indicated. The bunker's permanent population during its final weeks numbered somewhere between 30 and 60 people at any given time, a figure that fluctuated as officers arrived to deliver reports and, increasingly, failed to leave again once travel above ground became too dangerous. This included secretaries, adjutants, Hitler's personal physician, a small kitchen staff, and, from mid-April, Joseph and Magda Goebbels with their 6 children, who moved into the upper Vorbunker level having abandoned their own residence. Daily routine, so far as one existed, revolved around 2 military briefings, one around midday and one in the evening, both held in the cramped map room and both, according to multiple surviving attendees, growing longer and more fractious as April wore on. Meals were simple, prepared from whatever tinned and dried provisions remained in storage, and the only reliable news of the outside world came through a single radio link to naval headquarters at Plön in the north, since Berlin's own broadcasting facilities had by this stage been repeatedly knocked off air by bombing and shelling. It was from this claustrophobic, physically deteriorating environment that the final operational orders of the regime were issued, and it is here that the gap between command and reality becomes starkest. On April 22nd, during a military conference that several attendees, including General Alfred Jodl and General Wilhelm Keitel, later described in broadly consistent terms, Hitler suffered what witnesses characterized as a complete breakdown when informed that an ordered counterattack under SS General Felix Steiner had not been carried out, largely because Steiner's so-called army group possessed nowhere near the troops needed to execute it. Hitler reportedly raged for some time against his generals, accused named individuals of treachery and cowardice, and stated, according to multiple later accounts from those present, that the war was lost, and that he intended to remain in Berlin and take his own life rather than be captured. This is one of the better documented moments of the bunker's final days, corroborated across several independent post-war testimonies, though the exact wording used has inevitably varied slightly between accounts and should be treated as reconstructed rather than verbatim. From that point, historians generally agree, the bunker's function shifted decisively from directing a war to managing an ending. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep making detailed history like this. Two other decisions from this final period illustrate how orders issued from the bunker had, by this point, detached almost entirely from any coherent strategic purpose, and instead reflected the psychology of a leadership determined to deny an adversary anything of value. The first was the so-called Nero Decree, formally issued in mid-March 1945, ordering the destruction of German infrastructure, bridges, factories, transport and communication systems, ahead of the advancing Allied and Soviet forces, on the reasoning that a defeated Germany deserved no future. Albert Speer, by his own later account, actively worked to obstruct the decree's implementation, quietly instructing local officials to disable rather than destroy key installations, arguing that the German population would need this infrastructure to survive the peace. The extent to which Speer's post-war memoirs accurately reflect his contemporaneous motivations has been debated by historians, and some of his self-portrayal as a lone moral actor has been challenged by later research, but the decree itself, and the widespread failure to fully implement it, is well documented. The second was the continued, near-daily issuing of orders to relieve Berlin by forces that, by late April, existed mostly in name. The Ninth Army under General Theodor Buss was encircled in the Halbe Forest southeast of Berlin, and effectively destroyed attempting to break out toward the west rather than relieve the capital as ordered, at a cost historians estimate in the tens of thousands of dead among soldiers and the civilians who had attached themselves to the retreating column in hopes of reaching American rather than Soviet lines. General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, ordered to turn from facing American forces on the Elbe and instead march to Berlin's relief, made a genuine attempt, advancing further than most staff in the bunker had expected, but was halted at Potsdam, well short of the city center, by Soviet forces with overwhelming numerical superiority. Wenck's advance is one of the more poignant threads of this final period precisely because it was real. Unlike so much else discussed in the bunker's map room by this stage, his forces did fight their way to within reach of trapped civilians and soldiers on Berlin's western fringe, allowing a limited number to escape westward, before Wenck himself concluded further advance was impossible and began withdrawing his own men toward American lines instead. These were not abstractions playing out on a map. They were men marching and dying in specific forests and along specific roads, carrying out instructions issued from a command post that, by the final week of April, had only the loosest grip on where its own forces actually were, or on what remained physically possible for them to achieve. It is worth comparing this collapse of command coherence to how other Axis leaderships met their end, because the contrast is instructive. Benito Mussolini's fall in Italy had occurred in stages nearly 2 years earlier, beginning with his removal from power by the Fascist Grand Council in July 1943, followed by his rescue by German paratroopers and installation as the nominal head of a puppet state in the north, before his capture and execution by Italian partisans in April 1945, within days of the Berlin events described here. The Italian collapse was messier and more prolonged, but it lacked the specific feature of the German case, a single command bunker issuing operational military orders to real armies in the field, for a war effectively already lost, with the physical distance between command intention and battlefield reality growing daily. American and British command structures of the same period, by contrast, operated with redundant and dispersed communications, mobile headquarters, and, crucially, functioning general staffs who could challenge unrealistic orders through established institutional channels, with Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force spread across multiple secure locations rather than concentrated beneath a single collapsing capital. The German High Command's parallel structure, the OKW under Keitel and Jodl, technically still existed, but by April 1945, several of its senior figures were themselves either co-located in or shuttling to the same bunker, meaning there was no genuinely independent check on decisions, increasingly driven by one man's refusal to accept the military situation as his own. Generals understood it. Where Allied commanders of this period could and did revise orders in light of battlefield reporting, sometimes overruling political leadership on narrowly military grounds, the German system by this stage had collapsed into something closer to a single point of authority whose judgment went almost entirely unchallenged, not because subordinates agreed with it, but because the institutional mechanisms that might once have questioned it, an independent general staff, a functioning cabinet, a free press, had been deliberately dismantled over the preceding 12 years of the regime's existence, leaving nothing capable of correcting course when it mattered most. The impact of this final command period is best understood in two separate registers: the material and the psychological. Materially, the specific orders issued from the bunker in its last fortnight achieved essentially nothing of strategic value. No relief force reached Berlin, no counterattack altered the outcome, and the war ended within days regardless of what was commanded. Psychologically, however, the insistence on continued resistance, transmitted down through radio broadcasts and hastily distributed orders, extended the fighting in Berlin by a period that cost, by most historians' estimates, tens of thousands of additional military and civilian casualties in a battle whose outcome was no longer genuinely in doubt. The precise casualty figures for the Battle of Berlin remain contested between different historical sources, with estimates for Soviet military losses alone in the low tens of thousands and German military and civilian losses considerably harder to establish with confidence given the chaos of the city's final days. What is not contested is that Hitler and Eva Braun, who had married in a brief ceremony within the bunker on April the 29th, took their own lives on April 30th, 1945, and that Joseph Goebbels, who briefly succeeded Hitler as Chancellor under the terms of a political testament dictated in the bunker's final hours, followed with his wife Magda days later, after the couple had killed their 6 children. That political testament, dictated in the early hours of April 29th to a secretary and witnessed by several bunker staff, is itself a document historians treat as revealing of the command mindset described throughout this account. It dwelt at length on assigning blame for the war's outcome to others, named a successor government under Admiral Karl Dönitz, and made no reference to any surrender or negotiated end, instructing instead that resistance should in some form continue. Grand Admiral Dönitz, on receiving word of his appointment by radio message from the bunker, initially had no clear sense of how much authority he genuinely commanded, given how disconnected the appointment was from any functioning chain of command capable of enforcing it. The bunker complex itself was largely destroyed by Soviet forces after the war and later demolished entirely during East German redevelopment of the site in the 1980s. Today, the location, near the corner of Gertrude-Kolmarstrasse in Berlin, is marked only by a modest informational plaque in a car park, a deliberate choice by post-war German authorities to avoid creating any form of memorial or pilgrimage site. This absence of physical commemoration stands in notable contrast to the volume of popular fascination the bunker's final days continue to generate, sustained largely through surviving testimony, surviving fragments of documentary record, and post-war reconstructions, rather than any accessible physical site. Return for a moment to that birthday celebration of April 20th, cake served 55 feet below a burning city, to officers who could see clearly, even if they could not yet say so aloud, that everything the ceremony pretended to honor was already gone. That contradiction is the entire story of the Führerbunker's final command period, a headquarters that continued to issue orders with the formal authority of a functioning state, to armies that in any meaningful operational sense no longer existed, in defense of a capital that had already, in every calculation but one man's, been lost. The generals who received those final instructions did not disobey them out of courage so much as physical impossibility. There were simply no forces left to carry them out. What remained, in the last 10 days of the Third Reich's existence, was not command in any recognizable military sense, but the last, stubborn insistence of a regime that even total defeat should not be permitted to look like defeat. It failed. The war ended regardless within a week of the birthday party in the bunker,